Okay, so yeah, last video spoke on dependency theory as a very basic version of it. The way that theologians were starting to say we need to liberate ourselves from the situation of dependency. They do that in two ways. It's both they're referring to the economics because that's their primary interest is the plight of the majority of Latin Americans who are living in with the outcomes of economic dependency, which is poverty, which is exploitation, which is internal colonialism. And they're interested in liberating from a dependency on European theology, European Christianity, to make a Latin American Christianity one which reflects the life of the church, of the people in Latin America. So they go about doing this, and they're just starting. They're just starting to we're starting to hear here and there this talk of liberation, and at the same time we can talk of the beginnings of philosophy of liberation. People like Enrique Dussel, others, sociology of liberation, people like maybe Aldo Buntig and other names, and theology of liberation. But what is it that takes this from being a trickling of a few ideas here and there to become a movement so big, so dangerous to the people in power that the CIA will have documents on liberation theology, that the Vatican will declare a war on liberation theology, where priests and nuns and workers of many kinds are being killed because of their association with liberation theology. Today, we have whole academic departments of even Ivy League universities, which are liberationist in their outlook, in their study of Christian origins, in their intertextual work on coloniality and Christianity. And we have liberation theology has sowed seeds of intellectual life into the church universally. It's established worldwide organizations of solidarity and of intellectual new projects for third world thinking within the church, for listening to the voices of indigenous perspectives, of women's perspectives, of queer perspectives. Liberation theology has found a home in many different places after going through a real battle that took the lives of many people, and some of its first generation of thinkers. How did that begin? From just the few people speaking the word, you know what, we need liberation from the situation of dependency, and saying, and the gospel has something to say about this. How did it spark off? Well, there's a few coincidences. There's always a few coincidences when it comes to the birth of a social movement. And the church as well was already wanting to, in many places, wanting to reform itself. And it was happening right at the heart of things in the Vatican. So in 1962, the Vatican Council was called, the Second Vatican Council, lasted 3 years, where all the bishops from around the world would come to Rome for maybe the last couple of months of the year, across 3 years from 62 to 65, and they would meet to renovate, to renew the church. It was kind of like the Roman Catholic Church is finally responding to Protestantism, finally thinking we need to do some updating. I mean, we've not changed anything for ages. One of the most basic things that you know as a legacy from Vatican II is that the Mass the church service went from having to be said in Latin to now being said in the normal language of the people. It's a democratizing thing, that the people can actually understand what's being said for them, on their behalf. That alone allowed many things. It allows people who don't speak Latin to start being able to say the Mass, although, of course, it's still only priests that can do that. That council, brought together the whole world's worth of bishops. Hundreds of bishops from Latin America were there. And it just so happens that those young Catholic seminary students from Latin America who have been sent to Europe are in Europe at that very time. And they are called up from the universities, Lyon, the Louvain, Heidelberg, Rome, into the Vatican Council to serve as sort of advisors, pastoral advisors or clerks for the bishops, for the Latin American bishops. So now you've got a huge presence of Latin Americans in Rome, and they're specifically tasked by the popes, by the highest authorities. They're specifically being tasked with the idea of you need to do what you need to do in Latin America. We're behind you. What is it that you reckon needs to happen to make the church relevant, to bring life back into the church, to Latin Americanize the Latin American church? So there's a new license, there's a new you are allowed to go and do this. In fact, you're encouraged to do this. And you have different generations, and you've got bishops, and you've got the young intellectuals who have just been learning all of this cutting edge Marx and Freud and whatnot at the universities. At the universities as well, in the towns that they're in, within the Catholic movements at the time in Europe, 1960s, there's a lot of radicals. There's the Catholic workers movement, so that where priests were embedding themselves within the workers' movements, within the labor unions, they became worker priests. It was a sort of a term, it was mostly in France and in Belgium. They worked in factories, amongst the people. It was kind of an experiment in saying, like, how can we claim to speak for the people if we don't know what they live like at all? And priests can't live in more of this cloistered existence anymore. They said to themselves, we need to be out amongst the people. So that was weird, because that was kind of like an experiment, like let's slum it for a bit. But it did radicalize priests, and they become militant and part of the labor movement and whatnot in places like France, Belgium, everywhere. So that was one influence. But Vatican II was big. It was permission from the Pope themselves, because there's two popes who convened over the conference, and both of those popes they're like maybe 2 out of the 5 good popes ever. Now, there's also an institution called CELAM, which is the Council of the Latin American Episcopal Council. It's basically it was made in 1955, and it's basically a big sort of bureaucracy, a big governing body meant to sort of free up bureaucracy, in a sense, meant to gather all the bishops of Latin America together and help them collaborate with each other, help them set up new ministries, help them spread the good news. That's what the church does, right? More effectively. But this institution has been laying dormant for 10 years until Vatican II comes and says, look, man, you've got the institution, you've got the framework, really want you to start going ahead with it. And so that's what they do, encouraged by the Pope, encouraged by what has taken place at Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, including its pronouncements, its encyclicals that it's released to the world, saying it's right to use class analysis. It's right to speak of social classes. It's true that there is, discrimination, grinding poverty, and that it's unjust, that it's not just, the state of things, but that it's caused by, by exploitation. Pronounced on many of these themes that are so true for Latin America, and it's because of the Latin Americans being at the Vatican Council that the Vatican Council was able to see, very clearly about some of these things and make these pronouncements. Is also because the popes, the two popes who convened over it, we can consider them friends of Latin America, friends of the third world, that are very progressive. But yeah, that closes up in 65, and now the Latin Americans have the mandate to use the structure of CELAM and to begin to explore the themes of Vatican II for the Latin American context. And one of the themes itself is really the Latin Americanization or the indigenization, the local flavor, focusing on local problems and local solutions. As they are planning all the kind of things that happen in an institution, planning for a big, a conference of hundreds of bishops from every country, they've got to have lots of local meetings, right? Lots of meetings along the way. And it's at those meetings along the way between Vatican Council and Medellin, the big meeting that they're planning to have in 1968. It's at the meetings along the way that you start to see the names that you will later associate as the forefathers, the founding figures of liberation theology. So Gustavo Gutierrez, Segundo Galilea, Juan Luis II, Enrique Dussel, all the names start to appear there, and they're becoming influential. And they're becoming influential because of the clarity that they're bringing as academics, as people insightful in sociology, and as people who work, sure, very freshly, but who are working amongst the people. But what's an interesting name that you see right there at the start is Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich, who you might know from his books Tools for Conviviality, or Medical Nemesis, or Deschooling Society. Ivan Illich was a priest himself, European priest, who sort of got his training in a Puerto Rican ghetto in Harlem, or in somewhere in Manhattan in New York, and then had come as a missionary to Mexico, Cuernavaca in Mexico, and he hosted one of the very first meetings of that we could call a liberation theology meeting. He hosted the first meeting of liberation theology. In a sense, it was this 1964 in Petrópolis in Brazil, and Gutierrez was there, Juan Luis II was there, some others, Lucho Guerra was there from Argentina, and it was at that meeting and then some subsequent meetings that sort of the first working group of liberation theology was starting to develop. They started to meet each other and realize they had a lot in common. They'd all come, like I said, they all come back from Europe. There was the Vatican II had given them license to think again about what's happening in Latin America. They'd stumbled across dependency theory, and they realized we need liberation from the situation of dependence. And so the close bonds started to be formed already in 64. By the time it's 68, and there's the meeting where all of where the governing body of all the bishops, the decision makers in the church, are going to come and release their statements. As church, as churches, we like to release statements. But yeah, when that's about going to happen, that's 4 years later, and these young theologians are cultivating their own ideas, coming across a liberation theme, saying what would that look like for theology, and they're becoming influential, and they influence the shape of the documents that will be released at at the CELAM conference in Medellin. And those 4 years is where liberation theology sort of develops